Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're about to dive into a story that's pretty remarkable. A story about a scientist whose own personal tragedy forced her to question the very foundations of her world, neuroscience and consciousness. I mean, that's a pretty wild claim, right? But here's the thing. This is coming from Dr. Tara Swart, a medical doctor and a neuroscientist. And to really understand how she could possibly arrive at that conclusion, you first have to understand the event that shattered her reality.
So, to really get how she got there, we have to go back to the tragedy that just turned her entire world upside down.
You have to understand Dr. Swart's whole life, her entire career, was built on hard facts. Rationality, data, the scientific method, that was her world. I mean, she's a psychiatrist who has literally diagnosed people with psychosis for saying things pretty similar to what she was about to experience herself.
And then in 2021, her world just fell apart. Her husband, Robin, passed away from leukemia. And the timing, it was just brutal. It was only 2 days before what should have been their 4th wedding anniversary. As she put it, she was just totally lost and broken. And it was right there, in that deep, dark place of grief, that things started to happen. Things that, for a scientist like her, just made no sense at all. It started with something small. Robins. But not just 1 or 2. She was seeing them every single time she looked out the window. At first, you'd just brush it off as a coincidence. But it kept happening. And it started to feel like a sign she just couldn't ignore. Okay, but then it got more intense. One night, about 6 weeks after he was gone, something woke her up at 4 in the morning, and it wasn't a dream, it was a physical feeling, a massive thump on her shoulder, so hard there was no way she was imagining it. And this is the moment that changes everything. She opens her eyes, and she sees him. A hazy, kind of vague version of her husband, Robin, standing right there next to her bed. She just watches, completely frozen, as he seems to get clearer, and then he just dissolved from the head down. Can you even imagine? As a psychiatrist who literally diagnoses psychosis in other people, she had to ask herself the most terrifying question of all. Is this just grief? Or am I actually losing my mind? Am I having a psychotic break? But here's what's so amazing. Instead of just writing it all off as a delusion, she did what she was trained to do. She turned herself into the subject of her own investigation. She decided to use her scientific brain to figure out what the heck was going on in her own unexplainable world. So, where do you even start with something like that? Well, she began with a really basic question. How do we even experience reality? We all learn about the 5 senses, right? Turns out, that's not even close. The science actually points to us having at least 34 senses. 34! And a lot of them are working in the background, completely outside of what we're consciously aware of. Realizing this, it kind of blew the doors open for her. It led her to question one of the biggest, most fundamental ideas in all of neuroscience. What if the mind, our consciousness, isn't just something the brain cooks up? She started digging into this really fascinating neuroscientific model, one that connects creativity and, mental illness. It turns out they share some traits, like hyperconnectivity, where your brain makes all these wild connections, and a loosened mental filter that just lets more information flood in. And it made her wonder, could extreme grief do the same thing? Could it basically put her brain into this state of, expanded awareness? From there, her research went somewhere really profound, to the edge, to that mysterious border between life and death. She got really deep into this phenomenon called terminal lucidity. And get this, it's when people with severe, irreversible brain damage, we're talking brains that are just ravaged by disease, suddenly, right before they die, they become totally clear, perfectly coherent. It's something that, honestly, modern science has no good explanation for. How can a completely broken brain suddenly start working perfectly again? And of course, that led her to near-death experiences, or NDEs. She looked at thousands of documented cases. But you know what she found most compelling? The stories from other doctors.
because doctors are trained to be skeptical, right? They're the last people you'd expect to believe this stuff. And there was this one story from a researcher named Dr. Bruce Grayson that just, wow, it really stood out. So you've got this patient in the ICU. He goes into cardiac arrest. He has a near-death experience. And in it, he sees his main nurse. And she gives him a very, very specific message that he needs to pass along.
Okay, so the patient survives, he wakes up and he delivers the message. And that's when he finds out his nurse had just died in a car crash. The car was a red MG, a 21st birthday gift from her parents. Now think about that. How in the world could he have known that? It's verifiable information that was completely impossible for him to know through any normal means. So you start putting it all together, right? The robins in her garden, these impossible-to-explain near-death experiences, all of this evidence started pushing Dr. Swart toward a really new and, honestly, a pretty radical idea about what consciousness even is. But look, this skeptic in all of us is probably screaming right now. Confirmation bias, right? If you're looking for signs, you're going to see them everywhere. So she had to tackle that head on.
And her answer is actually rooted in neuroscience. It's a part of your brain called the reticular activating system, or the RAS. Think of it like your brain's bouncer. It's the filter that decides what gets your attention. It's why you can be in a super loud party and still hear someone say your name from across the room. Or, you decide to buy a red car, and suddenly, red cars are everywhere you look.
Now, most people would see that as a flaw, right? A bias. But Dr. Swart's take is completely different. She says, don't fight it, use it. She believes we can actually train our brain's filter, our RAS, to start noticing things we'd normally just ignore, to basically open ourselves up to a whole new stream of information. And this is where it all leads, to a conclusion that totally challenges the bedrock of modern neuroscience. The conventional view is that your mind is just a product of your brain. That's it. But her hypothesis suggests, what if that's wrong? What if consciousness can exist independently from our physical brain?
Look, this explainer isn't about giving you definitive proof. It can't. What it is about is the incredible journey of one scientist, a journey that took her from unimaginable grief to a completely new way of seeing the world. And it leaves all of us with a pretty profound question to chew on. What if the mind and body can operate on their own, and we just don't notice it until we're pushed to the absolute edge of our lives?